We encourage you to look at our school's website for the archive of all of the SCETL speaker events and webinars in the past 6 years, including all the lecture and dialogue events in the Civic Discourse Project. Our website is scetl.asu.edu. On the theme of civic discourse, we are very happy to have with us tonight some civic leaders from the Arizona community, including the chair of the Arizona Board of Regents, Lyndall Manson, the chair-elect of the Board of Regents, Fred Duvall, and Nedra Eldridge, who's the founder and co-chair of the Phoenix chapter of Braver Angels, a national organization dedicated to promoting and practicing civil discourse in American public life. Who cares about that? But Nedra, somewhere, I think Nedra is with us tonight. Also with us tonight is SCETL's distinguished visiting scholar this semester, Henry Olson of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Henry's also a columnist for the Washington Post. And I'll add a word of thanks here to Professor James Weinstein, our steadfast friend from Arizona State University's O'Connor College of Law. Jim serves on the committee planning this year's Civic Discourse Project events. And it's Jim who first introduced us to our speaker tonight, Professor Coleman. The school tries to convene a high-level conversation in the Civic Discourse Project with single speakers like tonight, dialogue events, and an annual conference each February. Altogether, we're trying to encompass a range of views on important issues of our times. This practice of intellectual diversity and of civil disagreement is a public extension of the school's academic program, our courses, our degrees, our student experiences that try to reconnect liberal arts education and civic education. We hope the students here and anyone here who cares about a higher kind of civic education will gather some information at the table outside about our degrees and academic programs, and also please take a look at our website. When our school was launched as a new department at ASU in 2017-2018, we immediately established an annual lecture to honor the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., and this national holiday. This is an occasion for us to celebrate a great civic leader and American statesman, to celebrate the principles he advocated, and also to mark his abiding faith in America's founding principles and constitutional order. He included that in his famous 1963 I Have a Dream address, and that is why we include the I Have a Dream address in the SCETL Pocket Constitution, along with the Declaration, the Constitution, and Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address from 1863. And that brings me to our speaker this evening, a constitutional law professor interested, among other things, in the legacy of Dr. King and the civil rights movement, what it means for the law and practice of free speech in America. Franciska Coleman is an assistant professor of constitutional law at the University of Wisconsin Law School, and she's the associate director of the East Asian Legal Studies Center. She's an interdisciplinary scholar drawing upon political theory, critical analysis, and constitutional law. She studies and teaches about the social justice implications of class and race in constitutional interpretation and the effects of institutionalized oppression on the self-governing capability of vulnerable groups. One of Professor Coleman's current research projects is understanding the anatomy of cancel culture, as she calls it. That's her topic tonight. And cancel culture's effects on marginalized groups as speakers. Her work has appeared in the First Amendment Law Review, the Journal of Free Speech Law, and the Boston University Law Review. Prior to joining the University of Wisconsin Law School, Professor Coleman was a visiting assistant professor at Washington University in St. Louis and a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School. She received her JD from Harvard Law School and her PhD in literacy, culture, and international education from the University of Pennsylvania. While studying at those institutions, she was awarded an American Association of University Women Selected Professions Fellowship and the Fontaine Fellowship. Our format tonight is that Franciska will speak for about 25 minutes. Then I will join her on stage here for a very hostile, aggressive interview questioning. Good, you're still listening. And in part 3 of the evening, our guest will take questions from the audience, so keep that in mind. And with that, for a presentation on the anatomy of cancel culture, please join me in welcoming Franciska Coleman. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I'm gonna stand here and move around because I always only talk to students and I have to keep their attention, so I have to move around. I am so thankful to be here. I'm always so excited to get to talk about my passion. So I'm gonna be watching for the time because I can talk about this all day. Kind of like, who is it, the Avenger character? I can do this all day. I can do this all day. Okay, anatomy of cancel culture, the social regulation of speech in the US. So I'm gonna have 4 points. First, I'm gonna talk about what is the social regulation of speech. Then how do people think the social regulation of speech works? Then how does the social regulation of speech actually work? And then maybe some best practices that we as citizens can engage in when we're asked to engage in the social regulation of speech. Okay, so what is the social regulation of speech? So I don't use the term cancel culture in my writing. I prefer a more neutral term, social regulation of speech. Some people use cancel culture. The other people on the other side use consequence culture. So I just try to be neutral and use social regulation of speech, which encompasses both of those things. And it's the process by which ordinary citizens in society use collective pressure on institutions to establish and enforce a set of regional or national speech norms, okay? One of the things that my research suggests is that this social regulation of speech is not a constitutional anomaly, but is actually presupposed by our First Amendment. Our First Amendment says no legal centralized regulation. That's actually not the same thing as no regulation, okay? But it just means no legal centralized regulation. But this leaves open communities choosing what kind of speech norms will be allowed and practiced in their communities, right? And so I say this is a choice that the First Amendment made. And one of the ways we know that it made that choice is because our First Amendment values of self-governance, marketplace of ideas, self-expression, actually requires people to be able to set norms around speech. All right. There are 3 types of speech that are the target of social regulation. The first type, is a very common type, censorable speech. Sometimes people refer to this as hate speech. But this is speech that is stigmatized and considered harmful across different discourse communities, across different people with different races, genders, political ideologies. There is a level of consensus. It's not unanimous, but there's a strong level of consensus that this speech is harmful and injurious. So that's censorable speech. Actually, very few speech, very little speech falls into that category. But you can think of it a little bit as group libel. This category actually is always in the process of becoming, because different groups, sometimes you can say, oh, that's rude to say, but we don't consider it kind of hate speech. But as groups kind of engage in activism in society, they can become recognized as a vulnerable group. And then speech that we thought was kind of rude and insensitive can actually become hate speech. So this category is not a closed category. It's a category that's constantly in process. The other is contested speech. So when groups are in the process of trying to become recognized as a marginalized group, such that, you know, marginalizing or disparaging things that are said about them will be classified as hate speech, we end up a little bit with like contested speech. Contested speech is very, very interesting. Because contested speech is speech that there is a sizable discourse community or group in society that believes this speech is high value speech that warrants First Amendment protection. But then there's a competing group in society that believes that this is actually low value speech that should be censored. And so that's why it is contested. When you think about this, you can think about Black Lives Matter, like speech around Black Lives Matter and policing. Some people think, oh my God, like this is like speaking truth to power, this is political speech, it must be protected. Other people feel like, oh my gosh, right, this is like hate speech against cops, like we need, you know, it's harmful, it's causing injury, we have to silence this speech. That's what makes it contested, that some people think it's valuable and other people think it's very, very harmful. Discreditable speech is tone policing, right? It's speech that's rude, that's insensitive, that's callous. We agree many times in society that it's low value. What we disagree about is whether it should be sanctioned in any particular way. And so you can think about, I think in Boston at one point, there was a person shortly after the Boston Marathon bombing. For Halloween, she dressed up as a victim of the Boston Marathon bombing, and she took a picture and like put it on, and people were like, it wasn't that she was marginalizing any particular group, right? And it wasn't that anyone thought her speech was high value, but it was kind of rude, callous, and insensitive, and she actually lost her job. Okay, so here is just kind of some examples of these categories, kind of similar to what I already told you. This was a tweet about the Obama White House and claiming this is moving day. So this is like censorable because it's like racial, slurs. Contested, this is Kaepernick kneeling for the flag. And then you have discreditable. I think the Rockets were playing the Mavericks, and so there is this gun pointed to a horse, and this person was fired for emoji violence. So it may seem as if these categories are like, we can look at speech or we can listen to speech and we know what category it belongs in. But as I said, these categories are contested, they're evolving. And actually what happens when you have a cancel culture incident is that actually normally the speaker thinks, oh, this is contested speech, or this is, maybe I was rude, this is discreditable speech. But then many times the other side thinks, no, this is like injurious speech. So these categories are not objective categories. They're subjective categories, and people can disagree about what speech goes into which category, and it depends on who they are, right? Different people with different affiliations, with different norms of speech are going to evaluate speech differently. Okay. So that's social regulation of speech. How do people think social regulation of speech works? There are two primary narratives about how the social regulation of speech works. One narrative is the cancel culture narrative, and the other narrative is the consequence culture narrative. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about those two narratives. The consequence culture narrative assumes that social regulation of speech, most of the time, almost all the time, is directed towards censorable speech, okay? It's censored, this is, the Holocaust began with words, right? This is speech that is marginalizing, demeaning, dehumanizing, and just a couple of steps away from actual physical violence. For some people, this speech itself is actually violence, right? And so the consequence culture narrative is that most of the speech that people are being fired over is this kind of harmful, injurious speech. Now, there is censorable speech, sexual harassment, death threats, right? These are the examples people use, right? And the assumption is most of the speech is like this. It's like sexual harassment, it's like death threats. And so transgressive speech, by transgressive speech, I just mean speech that someone has claimed as transgressive, not that it's actually transgressive in any particular way. So that's the consequence culture narrative. And so I don't know how many of you were aware, or you watched The Closer, are you aware of the fur over the closure? But this is an example of a consequence culture narrative. One of the people who worked for Netflix, who is also a member of the trans community, had this to say: you're going to hear a lot of talk about offense. We aren't complaining about being offended. What we object to is the harm that content like this does to the trans community, okay? So in the consequence culture narrative, we are not talking about offensive speech. We're talking about injurious speech, okay? Then you have the cancel culture narrative. The speech that is being punished in the cancel culture narrative, most of the speech is actually not in any way hate speech. It's speech that's controversial, it's speech that's contested, it's speech that's discreditable, by which I mean it's rude or insensitive or callous, okay? That's the lay version of cancel culture. There are some academic critics of cancel culture, and they say even if the speech is hate speech, even if it is censorable speech, censoring it actually does more harm, right, to society and speakers than whatever harm is suffered by the listeners, okay? Most of the time when people are talking in the cancel culture narrative, they kind of put to one side the existence of, harassing speech, death threats. Like they're clear, like, yeah, that's not what's happening, that's not what's on the table, that's not what we're talking about, that's rare, okay, in the cancel culture narrative. Instead, the cancel culture narrative says all of the things that are being, sanctioned by universities and employers are just speech that some random subjective group of people found offensive, or some speech that is controversial. And so we have Donald Trump giving us the kind of definition of cancel culture. The goal of cancel culture is to make decent Americans live in fear of being fired, expelled, shamed, humiliated, and driven from society as we know it, right? And there's a sense in which cancel culture is like, this is bullying, there is a Pew Research survey where one of the people said, yeah, the idea of holding people accountable for their speech is kind of supposed to be an anti-bullying type of intervention, but actually the people who engage in sanctioning the speech are themselves the bullies. And so that's part and parcel of the cancel culture narrative. So you guys are wondering, so which one is it actually? It's neither. Both of them are partially true, and both of them are partially false. And so the way in which cancel culture works, there are actually 5 phases that I'm going to talk about now. So first, in order for there to be social regulation of speech, there needs to be some way for the speech to get into society. This is dissemination or publication. Second, there is an accusation. Someone somewhere has an accusation. There is pillory, which I will describe in another slide, sanctions, and then there is direct action. And direct action is designed to amplify something that happened in the earlier phases. So I'm going to go through each one of these. So first, the speech has to get out into society. So normally that's a tweet, a Facebook post. If you're talking about a university campus, podcasts, lectures, news, interviews, all of these kinds of things. Academics are very fond of speaking in public. And so normally you get a lot of cancel culture occurrences with academics because they are we are kind of paid to speak in public. And so tweets, Facebook posts, cable, online media, podcast. The accusation. Someone sees the publication, right? They see the tweet, they see the Facebook post, they hear a recording of the video. Most of the time, the academic or the speaker intended for the speech to be public, and so they intended for it to reach varied audiences. They may have thought they were talking, when you have your Twitter profile, you have your followers, but most of the time it's public, so people who aren't your followers can see it as well. So normally, the people who bring the accusations, they're actually not the Twitter followers, who are the genuine followers and that we agree with you. It's actually kind of the people who didn't like you in the first place, right, who bring the accusation. So the accusation has this challenge of being, you are one type of person with kind of certain speech norms, and you have a discourse community that has certain speech norms. There's a certain way you talk. There's certain things you assume about the world. Then there's another discourse community, normally a competing discourse community, that sees things differently. When you have accusations, they are normally across discourse communities, right? So it's almost like people speaking 2 different languages, right? And so they are kind of accusing each other. Who does the accusing? Normally, it's someone who has an affiliation with the institution. If you see an accusation, they're going to say, as a student in this institution, I cannot believe you're allowing this to happen, that you employ a professor who would say this kind of thing, right? Or if you're a customer, right? Oh my gosh, as a customer, right, I will no longer, give my service to a business that employs this type of person, right? There's an interesting thing happening here, right, which I'm going to kind of talk about in a later slide, but I'll mention now, which is kind of the equation of, the worst thing you ever said with who you are, right? And that's kind of an illusion that's problematic, right? And it's also what kind of feeds the idea that what we're dealing with most of the time is not consequences, but cancellation. How do they make these accusations? The same way the speech became public in the first place, through tweets, emails, phone calls, internal discussion boards, direct action, right? Okay. the pillory. This is almost like the stocks, right? This is, when you think about what happens after the accusation is made, it's really similar to the kind of old-fashioned pillory, where they would like put you up in the marketplace, the market square, and then people, random people passing by would see you there, and then they just throw whatever's in their hand, right? And this happens, like once you have been accused, your tweet, your statement is like put up in the square, right? The internet markets version of the market square, and various people come by and they just, add abuse and scorn on you. Occasionally, in the old-fashioned pillory, there would be people who were like, what happened? No, they didn't do anything wrong. And they throw a flower, right, instead of, feces. And occasionally that happens in the internet marketplace, where some people try to defend you. Like, oh, it wasn't that bad. If actually most of the people speaking are defending you, maybe you can successfully escape cancellation. If not, if most of the people are, piling on with abuse and scorn, then maybe you don't. It also depends on who these people are, okay? Universities care about their donors, their alumni. So if you are a university speaker, right, and alumni and donors are like, then maybe that criticism from alumni and donors is going to weigh more with the speaker than some defense from random unaffiliated people, okay? So relationships and power and cultural capital matter in the pillory. Sanctions is the last phase. So if in the pillory, the opinions of the people that the university cares about are against the speaker, it's likely that there will be some form of sanction. The favorite sanction is forced resignation or being terminated. That's like, occasionally you get a verbal condemnation. For universities, right, if you're tenured, you're likely to get a verbal condemnation. If you're untenured, right, or you're a lecturer or an adjunct, out the door, okay? So the universities are very responsive. Now, one of the challenges is that this often happens so quickly that before the people who want to defend your speech can actually ever speak up, you've already been terminated. I don't know if some of you probably are familiar. It's been trending in various news stories, the kind of Hamlin controversy, right? So quick, right? By now, all of these people are like, no, this was unjust, this was unjust. This is kind of coming later, right? They've already been the accusation, the piling on, and the sanction. And so the defense is kind of lagging behind. And that's actually problematic because it's very hard for a university. Well, it's very hard for people, right? But also, to say, my bad, I made a mistake, right? I mean, that's, particularly if a person has been fired, they're gonna have a lawsuit, and all I need for my lawsuit to get big bucks is you to admit that this was wrong. So it's very, very important, right, that we get the defense and all of the kind of concerns and defenses of the speech, like in the moment before the sanction is applied. So I have another example here of like a tweet. This all happened in one day, right? So if you're a university, sometimes it can take a week or two, but many times from the accusation, from the publication to the termination of your job is literally like a day. So she makes this tweet where she kind of curses out the first lady. This is from 2016. And then someone is like, she's a racist. And then someone else is like, oh my God, like I'm your customer and you're hiring racists, like why? And someone else is like, why are you still employing this racist? And this person is like, just imagine what she's doing to your customers. And then, right, within a day, they're like, this person is no longer employed, right? And so this can be a very, very, very abbreviated process. Okay, so that's how cancel culture, social regulation of speech actually works. There's nothing about the process that means it only addresses censorable speech. There's nothing about the process that means it only addresses, contested or discreditable speech. What we know is that who gets sanctioned depends a lot on the institutions and what they value. And we know that people who are valued by the institution, right, are not going to be canceled, and people who have less value, less status in the institution are more likely to be canceled. And that's not about what they said, right? So you can have a person who uses the N-word in class, right? Or who literally says black people are not smart. And that person may, right, just have, oh, you will no longer teach required courses. Some people feel like that's what happened with, is it Waxman at Penn, right? Other people feel like, oh, you just said, there's racism in America's past, and you're fired, right? Because you are an untenured lecturer. Okay, so it's not always about the words, right? The sanction and the words don't always go together, and that's part of the problem. So what are some best practices? First, I think it's very important to realize that when people are talking and they're putting Facebook posts, they're putting tweets, that they're actually kind of performing a particular role, a particular identity. So the idea that, aha, we see the real you, right? That may not quite be accurate, because when we're putting things in front of the public, we're actually always trying to become and to be who we want to be, right? And who we think we are. But that doesn't mean that any single utterance or any post or any tweets captures the whole of who we are. Sometimes we're trying to be, a good, ally, right? And so as a good ally, we're going to be really harsh, right, to whatever person we think transgressed and marginalized, another group, right? If we're trying to be kind of, good intellectual, we may question things in a very strong and, stringent way, not because, we don't value whatever the underlying issue is, but because in that particular moment, we're trying to show that we're a particular kind of person doing a particular kind of thing, and the only way we can do that is through our words and our language, okay? So we need to bear in mind, right, that there is kind of some identity construction going on here that is expressive, but that's also performative, right? Maybe we don't like the performance, right, and that's fine, but that doesn't mean the person, right, is that this performance is a sum total of the person. The second is, when we see accusations, and we'll all see them, right? If you're in any kind of, group, you're going to see accusations, you're going to hear accusations. If you're on social media, you might see and hear them more often, because that's one of the primary platforms by which this transpires. Is be selective, choose your battles, right? And I think as humans, right, it can be tempting, right? I know myself, when something happens, I want justice, however I define that. And one way I can get justice as a single person is to get other people, right, to help me, right? And I feel like we're in a generation, one of the things I tell my students, and this is what I tell them I think is happening, we kind of lived with kind of the harms that came from a generation that was silent, and that didn't speak up and didn't help people, and there were all kinds of atrocities that happened because of that. And so this generation, I think, is very sensitive to wanting to speak up on behalf of those who are claiming injustice, right? It's like, oh my gosh, we don't want to let that cry go unheard. But I think it's also very important to be selective, to choose our battles, and to really take time to say, what happened? And I know people are like, don't blame the victim, believe the victim. But I think we still have to be selective, and we have to kind of think about, when do we pile on and when do we don't? I don't think the answer is to never pile on, but I think the answer can't be to always pile on, okay? The second is pillory stage, local, local, local. I think social regulation of speech works better when it happens in the local community, right? Because one of the things about the local community, many times, is actually that person. You've seen them, you've kind of walked with them, they are a real person and not just disembodied words. And so I think being most active in the things closest to you also means you probably are more likely to have the truth of the matter, right? But it also means that you're not as much at risk of dehumanizing the person, okay? So as much as you can, when you're choosing your battles, try to choose local battles, because those are the ones that you know more about. You know more about the norms, because they really are your norms, right? And you can be a little bit more comfortable. Sanctions. Know the value of an apology. I just feel like if you say, I'm sorry, you take the tweet down, that has no effect whatsoever many times, right? And it's very interesting, right? Because it's very hard. Like, even if you're later vindicated, that group, that flash mob that came together, right, they're gone, right? So who, in fact, do you actually make your apology to, right? That's one of the problems. But I think sometimes people use an apology as an admission of guilt, right? Which means, yes, we should have sanctions. But I think there's another way to look at an apology, right? Which means sometimes, I told you that what we're doing when we're speaking is actually enacting our identity. And very few people there are people who like deliberately try to say, I'm a racist, this is who I am, and I'm gonna, get tweets and likes from that. Very few people do that. Most people actually were trying to enact a different identity. It came across as a racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, et cetera identity. And they're like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, right? And I think that there should be room for that, right? As, a society of saying, okay, you messed up, and there should be repair. Because I think we do want to reintegrate people into society. And we also understand that actually, there's a kind of verse that says, whoever has never, made a mistake with their words is a perfect person, right? And I don't know that any of us are perfect people. Sometimes we talk with people who give us grace, so we may not be aware of our imperfections. But I think it's very important to understand that as humans, we actually do say things that we don't mean. If anyone has ever been angry, right, I hope your family members didn't video you and put it out into the public. But we've all, and maybe we're fortunate, right, that it didn't go viral, but we've all done that. And I think bearing that in mind and realizing that there actually can be genuine apologies is very important. And then justice is not one size fits all, which means there are different types of offensive speech, there are different types of injurious speech, and we should try to make sure the punishment fits the crime. And we should also consider time, right? Was this something 25 years ago? That's a little bit different than if you say it today, because 25 years ago we had different understandings of who's vulnerable and who's not, right? And sometimes some people are pioneers, right? They had these attitudes like right away. Some people are settlers, right? They didn't get these attitudes until later. But I think the fact that discourse norms change over time is a good thing, right? Because that means that the protests, the activism, the agitation actually made a difference. And so I don't think we ever want to dismiss that. All right, and that's statute of limitations, which would be sometimes, right to be forgotten, Sometimes we have to let things go. Like, we actually are human beings, we change, right? We really actually do change. I tell people I'm an educator. That means I believe that people can change. If I didn't believe people could change, I would not be an educator. And so I think just realizing if it happened long ago, or that just because it happened today doesn't mean like you can never teach again, right? Or you can never speak again. But I think realizing, right, that people have the capacity to change, then we'll invest a little bit more in dialogue and reconciliation. I think it's much better, right, to make an ally of a former enemy than to actually have them become like an even worse enemy. So I'm out of time, so I'm gonna stop there. Thank you all for listening.
Just make sure we have Arizona PBS, give them a chance to set the cameras. Okay. Thank you for those remarks, Franciska, and that presentation. So I thought I would pose some questions that start with some follow-up about the analysis you provide of the problem, and then move toward the remedy or the best practices and the solutions that you propose to us. So start with the analysis of the dilemma we find ourselves in, starting especially with university communities. That one side of this view about a cancel culture or limiting speech emphasizes the important aim of the university as knowledge production or inquiry or debate or discussion. And another voice or side in the debate emphasizes the importance of a university community being a community. And so all students, faculty, staff feel welcome there to participate in the aims of seeking knowledge, seeking truth, knowledge production, et cetera. So this raises the question of the tensions that I think you are saying can never really go away. or not likely to go away soon. So is that a fair? Okay. So could you talk a little bit more about those tensions and why they're not likely to go away?
Yeah. So yes, I think one of the things that has kind of happened over time as the university is, in addition to the university's kind of mission to kind of disseminate knowledge, like we now view the university as also a place of like equality, right? We're going to kind of, when they talked about affirmative action, they were like, oh, we need, these type of leaders. And so we view the mission as not just about knowledge, but as also about an important vehicle for making kind of an inclusive society that's more egalitarian across race, gender, ethnicity, that kind of thing. And so I think those two missions can seem to be in tension, but I think there is a way in which we have to have a both and instead of an either or orientation. Because many times sometimes we view this group as listeners and this group as speakers, and that's where the tension comes from, right? Like we have, the professors are about academic freedom, but then we have to make the students feel included. Or, conservatives are saying this, but you are, maybe do like privilege. People with race privilege are saying this, but the people without race privilege are feeling this way. And so we kind of divide these groups, and the fact that we think different people have academic freedom and different people need to be included, rather than realizing actually on the campus, people need both, right? Like nowadays they talk about, yes, we want to have inclusion for like conservatives, right? And actually some speakers are actually minority groups. And so I think if we realize that our community is not divided into two distinct groups, one of which wants diversity and inclusion and one of which wants academic freedom, but helping our communities realize, okay, actually, the people who want diversity and inclusion also need academic freedom, right? And the people who need academic freedom also need to be included. And I think that's a way to kind of bridge the gap.
And then the importance of higher education in American society means that if college and university communities, or this now, in the internet age especially, this one national community that's resides in the internet, if the people who focus on ideas and discourse and talking can't find their way toward this view of balance that you're talking about, and I think you mean constantly renegotiating and talking about a balance, then is it fair to say it will be very difficult in broader American social discourse and civic discourse and political discourse to have, less of the canceling or claims about canceling, less of the anger and vilification. If universities and colleges can't even do this, then it will be very difficult or impossible in broader society.
I would definitely agree. I do think universities are kind of thought leaders, and they also model things for society. And I think it's actually one of the things I love about the university. Many times, unfortunately, our K-12 education is still very, very segregated, right? And it's still very kind of homogenous in some ways, right? Not totally. There are some exceptions, but many times the university is the first time where we actually get people with very, very different views all together in one space, right? That's scary, right? And it's gonna be controversial, but it's also such an opportunity. When you talk about creating like a citizenry that views themselves like we're in this together, right? That's the first time where we really actually get to do that hard work of being in it together. And so I think universities play such an important role in showing us how to make a nation from so many diverse parts, because the university is a place in which so much of our diversity is in one place. I don't know that there's any other environment where that happens to the same degree.
And could I ask you about, on this theme of inclusion, the rise in importance across the past 50, 75 years or more of these questions of identity and communities identifying a certain way, communities self-identifying as historically disadvantaged or formerly marginalized. And on, again, this general theme I'm posing about balances and tensions, how there's a particular tension in university communities and beyond between free speech, promoting free discourse to produce knowledge and seek truth, and on the other hand, how you recognize past harms of racism or past harms of some identity group that feels marginalized, has been marginalized, how that identity question, especially about race, but maybe not exclusively about race, poses a particular difficulty in this entire conundrum that we're facing.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I'm going to take your question the right way. I'm not quite sure. But what I thought in response was just this, there was a time in which the university was able to kind of do things very simply because it was like science is objective and neutral, right? And one of the things that happens when you kind of get more inclusion and diversity is that you actually realize science can be unobjective and non-neutral. And the question is, when is science being unobjective and non-neutral? And I think that's something the university has to navigate, because when the university is seeking for truth, sometimes groups will say, well, that search for the truth is biased. And before, that wasn't even something you could say, because we were all like, no, science is never biased. But once we acknowledge that science can sometimes be non-objective and biased, then it's very hard, then almost it's very easy to question truths. And the search for knowledge becomes much, much more of a negotiation, because there's always a chance that someone will say, well, we think this is a biased question. We think your starting point was biased.
And you're using science broadly to meet you,
like
social sciences, as well as humanities,
I think the empirical sciences, right, were the main ones that had this claim to objectivity. But when you think about, oh my gosh, when they were like, yes, it's biological determinism, right? And so I think that we see the problem more in the hard sciences just because they seem more objective. But of course, I think it's always been a problem in the social sciences, but I think because it's also kind of become such a thing that affects both, then it's become more aggravated, I think, in the social sciences. And so what we consider to be truth and objective is much more contested. And then I think that does create a problem, because sometimes you can say, well, no, this is just knowledge. This is just truth. This is just, this is just my research, right? But then it becomes open to question by these groups. And I think you have to have some kind of way, right, of actually still being able to do work, but also kind of respect the concerns that other groups have. And so I think we have to find another way other than, either or, right? I think we have to find a way to balance those two, right? To understand, there are concerns sometimes about scientific research that can be harmful, but at the same time, sometimes scientific research harmful doesn't mean false, right? And I think we have to get to that point where we can kind of acknowledge, even though science may have some kind of interested things going on, it may not always be purely objective. We can't always equate harmful outcomes that say things we don't want to say with false outcomes. And so I think that's something that we're struggling to navigate, and it requires kind of dialogue to a degree across groups that we don't always have, even at the university campus.
To follow up on that, you mentioned a few moments ago schooling level, K-12 education, but I want to ask you about the larger theme of the civic education that I think is presupposed especially by your proposed best practices, the possible remedies, lowering the temperature, maybe, to use that metaphor on all this. So could you talk about the kind of education in K-12, but in the higher education space as well, and then of course there's this feedback loop, for cycle between the two of them. And we talked about this a little earlier today. Civic virtues, you talked about dialogue or don't dehumanize people. And, civic virtues of civil disagreement, of tolerance, of appreciating pluralism, as well as some harder, more empirical kinds of civic knowledge that you're presupposing or that you're recommending, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So how to teach civic virtues in K-12?
Well, is that what you're calling for? That there is a kind of civic education you're at least implicitly calling for that needs to be renewed, restored, emphasized if we're going to lower the temperature and achieve the kinds of dialogue and balance, striking of balances that you're recommending?
Yes, I think we definitely need to make sure that our students have an understanding of how democracy works. One thing I tell my students all the time, the people you disagree with and the people you don't like still have a right to vote. And I think that's very important to take into consideration, because sometimes my students take positions and they fight for positions as if the other side is silenced and powerless, and they don't see any space for compromise, and can really kind of dismiss and disparage compromise as something almost like selling out in a way. And so I think having an awareness of the strengths and weaknesses of democracy, right? And that actually, people we disagree with having a voice is actually a value, even though it makes things inefficient and more difficult. And I think also maybe ensuring that students understand that even though democracy is slow sometimes, right? Because you have to persuade people. If you could just order people, change would happen immediately, right? But when you actually have to persuade people, that makes change slower. And sometimes change can be so slow that our students stop believing in the possibility of change, right? Through persuasion, right? And then they want, force. But I think we need to use civic education to make sure students understand that democracy is slow and that change is sometimes slow, but also not to give up on it, right? To still have this hope in democracy and in a process of change that is, even though it's incremental. And I think incremental change these days may not be, sexy, right? Because we want like massive change right now. And sometimes there has been quick change, but sometimes that quick change is only on the surface, right? And but slow change can actually permeate the society. And I think if we have some kind of civic education where students kind of understand, right, how democracy works and why, with all of its weaknesses, it's still the least worst, right? Because sometimes, when I talk to my students, literally, I've had students tell me, they would much prefer, they almost sound like they don't want democracy, right? Because they don't want people.
These are law students you're talking about, right? These are graduate students in law.
Because they don't want, the bad people, right, to impact their lives and to be able to vote on their rights and on their interests. And I think we have to find a way of telling a story about who we are and about why democracy matters and about the dangers of the alternatives, so that students can see the trade-offs and kind of become more accepting of those trade-offs.
Thank you. I want to finish by talking about Martin Luther King, and because you just expressed in some way asking students that in a civic education at the law school level or at the graduate level, undergraduate level, in K-12, suggesting to students they should have a kind of faith in our constitutional democracy, in this very messy set of processes that we have that promote dialogue or require that you have to hear different views across different institutions, right? So I wanted to finish by asking you about King and the example he sets of someone fighting against injustice, but insisting to a majority that he shares a faith in, a confidence in, the legitimacy of the whole constitutional order and the principles that stand behind it, the principles of the Declaration. So he's asking us to strike this kind of balance, right? There is injustice. He is impatient. It has taken too long. But there is, in the background, he had a kind of education. He's calling for a kind of renewal of these civic virtues, so that peoples who were not talking to each other, or not communities that were not talking to each other, not recognize each other, could talk to each other, could get beyond conflict and try to find compromise, try to establish a new consensus. Am I interpreting your King the right way, or your view of King in the right way, or am I getting something wrong there?
Yeah, so I think you are interpreting King in a way. I think the problem that we have now is I'm not sure this is the generation of King, right? I recall reading Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he said something that my students found very persuasive, and he was very critical of the civil rights movement because he asked, why do we have to give our bodies to the bully clubs in order to get our rights? Why do we have to go through all that? Like, some people can just vote and they get their rights, but we have to, go to jail and like be beaten up and like, ultimately King was assassinated. But I think there is value in, I don't know, one of the things that, I struggle with this, because obviously I kind of can understand, right? Like, I don't want to bear the burden, because when you have change like King promotes, there is a burden on the people seeking change, right? They have to actually go through and endure a lot. And I think one of the transformations of society that came about as, a result of King is that, now people feel, a little bit, for King, it was kind of like, people were so downtrodden, right? And so giving that sacrifice, giving their bodies, it was just like, I don't know, there was no other choice. But once you kind of have really kind of felt like we've really promised equality, right? Now you've said we've really cashed the check, then it becomes a lot harder, right, for people to engage in that kind of tolerance and discourse. And so I think it's an uphill battle. I think that there is definitely, we need to find a way to get people to be willing to be in it for the long haul, right? And to kind of endure, one of the things about change taking a long time is that you actually are enduring injustice while you wait for the change to happen. And I think we're just, one of the things I told people, so I'm a law professor, and there are like people who've been law professors before me, and there were things that they put up with, right, and that they would never have challenged, right, because of the times, right? Whereas, I recall I was telling someone something, and they were just like an older Black woman, and she was like, right, that's your complaint these days, like they're not like burning crosses or hanging nooses, and so I think that there is a way in which progress itself can make us less patient. And so how do we, patience is one of those civic virtues, but I think the more we win, the more impatient we become. And so I'm not quite sure how to get a kind of King-like approach to these problems to a group of people who feel like, King's approach didn't work because we still have to go through similar. And it's not, one of the things I tell my students, I try to tell them that it's not the same. There has been progress. But there can be a way in which you can see the glass as half empty or half full. And so how do we get the students to see it as half full instead of half empty, and to see, like, even though the civil rights movement didn't do everything, right, that we wanted it to do, it actually did some things. Maybe it was 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but that's still 1 step further than where we were before. So I don't know. I think one of the things I tell my students is I think we need a third way. I think we have to find something new for this generation. I think they're kind of rejecting a little bit the slow and steady pace. And I think we have to give them the tools so that they can see the need for cross-cultural, cross-racial, cross-distance and difference dialogues. But I'm really hopeful that they will find a different way of being tolerant, maybe, than what we have. So I don't know.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Well, now we have time for questions from the audience. We have a microphone in the center aisle. We do like to have, and we do often have, students posing questions. For those of you here with us the first time, I always say at this time, the idea is to pose a brief question to our guest, and so that means you should try to be brief, and you should actually pose a question rather than making a statement. Only Franciska and I get to make long statements and be long-winded. So go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you so much. I'm a postdoc here at SCETL. I don't have a fully formed question, but I have a direction. So it'll just take me about 10 minutes. Okay, so it seems to me that one of the divides, one of the distinctions is between action and liberal learning. There's something about action, needing to do something right now, which requires us to cut off learning to some degree. To to take an action is to say we've learned enough and now we must do something with that action. And all of our life from birth is always calling on us to act. It's always calling us to do something right now. We're always confronted with things that are saying, you've got to solve this problem. And my understanding of the possibility of liberal learning is that there is a time when we can kind of just suspend the need to act for a time, not for our whole lives, so that we can hear things, hear the voice of something calling to us that we might not hear if we want to close off knowledge to act. And so I think the question is, how do we do different, is the university for action or is it for this liberal learning? And can those things, it seems actually they can be mixed like a layer cake, but you can't have both at the same time. Are you inquiring or are you acting? And what's the role for this suspension of action? And can we swamp that and be kind of in the action mode all the time and then lose the values of liberal learning?
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, so I am a person who resists the either or. I always tell people I am a both and person. And so I would have to say, I think you can actually learn by doing, it's not impossible. But I think it's hard. And I think when you learn by doing, maybe you're doing less, right? And maybe you're changing less. Particularly, I'm from the law school, right? So our students literally learn by sometimes doing their clinics. And so maybe I would say that it's not either or, but like the balance between, right? Not 100% learning or 100% action, but can you find a medium, right? Where there's some parts of your education, right, where you're just learning, right? And listening and thinking. But I think for students, right, when they're in college, like that's the time when they're most passionate and most zealous. So I don't want them to put action completely on hold, but I think that they have to not just do action. So I think they need informed action. And maybe if we pose it that way, that might make them engage a little bit more with the life of the mind.
Evening, Professor. Thank you so much for being here. But first off, I just wanted to say I actually spent a little bit of time in Wisconsin. If you know any Hmong people, I actually learned the language of Hmong, which is fairly common in Wisconsin. So I actually went through a pretty horrible experience last year and got, quote unquote, actually canceled. And I found out over the coming days that there was multiple people who hated me enough to be gathering information about me for the past 3 to 4 years. And it kind of all came out, and ultimately my employer had to make the difficult decision to let me go. It was one of the most miserable weeks and a half of my life. Wouldn't wish it on the worst person in the world. And my question is basically, how do people who go through that experience learn to move on and be forgiven, and how do we as a society learn to forgive others who, are accused of these horrible things or accused of things out of context, when the mob and basically everybody was piling on, and then I was able to kind of prove that it was false, and then it kind of died down. But how do we not become part of the mob mentality and learn to slow down and think?
Yeah, I think it's very hard. I think your question kind of tells us, right? Slow down and think. But I think we are very reactionary, and it's very difficult sometimes to slow down and think and get all of the facts. But I would say, like I said, maybe like I said earlier, like taking apologies seriously, and I would say not overreacting. Keeping in mind that the speaker is human, the person challenged is human, and that it's only kind of a partial account, right? I think no person is all good. There was a movie, Anatomy of a Murder, right? No one is all good or all bad, right? They're kind of complex. And so I think for employers and people making those decisions, for what I actually advocate, and this is not this article, but in a different article, is people having a policy in advance, right? Before the mob forms, have a policy so that they know what's off the table. And that can actually be protective. Because if the mob has already formed and you say, I'm not gonna fire this person, it's enraging. But if you have a policy, like in advance, before the mob forms, that says we only suspend for 2 weeks, we only do da-da-da-da-da-da, then that becomes the norm, right? That you kind of set expectations. And then people that ask, when that is the background context, that firing is not on the table, the ask will be different, and maybe it'll be less harmful to the person. So I think setting some norms in advance would be good.
Thank you.
So when I get into conversations with people about this topic, a lot of the times the issue that they have is not necessarily with the firing or the action of consequence, it's what prompted the consequence. Specifically, when we're talking about language, language is rapidly changing. In what would have taken a generation's worth of change, back in my parents' day, now it takes 3 months, 6 months. So my question for you is, how can somebody who's maybe not it has their nose in the current events and newspapers, how can they stay up to date on language to have these conversations so they don't get what they would call ambushed by something they didn't know or know was wrong or know had gone from contested to censorable?
Yeah. So I guess, I actually don't advocate trying to kind of stay up to date on all the language because, as you said, it changes so rapidly. And also, it's contested, right? Like, I was just talking to someone. When we talk about diversity DEI, I don't know if we say JEDI or DEIB, right? It's still being worked out, right? And so I think what is needed instead is a mentality shift and the recognition that there is no book, right, that tells me all of the proper things to say and all of the proper things to avoid saying. And I think I don't want to encourage us to think that there's just a way to stay up on top of everything. I think the more important thing is to realize, right, that no one has a book, right? And you may have thought this was the current thing. And my degree was in multicultural education, and I don't even know, right, what all of the things are. So I think what's needed is not trying to learn everything, but more uncertainty and more recognition that we don't actually know everything. We can't know everything. And so we have to be a little bit more, we have to give each other a little more grace, and we have to talk through things a little bit more. And that's why accepting apologies is so important, right? Because it's really true. Sometimes they say you didn't know because you didn't educate yourself. Well, actually, sometimes, right, it's not possible to educate yourself because I need a guide, a definitive guide to educate myself, and that those definitive guides don't always exist, or you looked at the wrong one. So I was in Korea, right? And I thought I was, I knew everything. But actually, there were so many things that I didn't know about being offensive, right? But I was treated with grace, and I learned more. But of course, I still don't know, right, everything. And so I think a little more uncertainty, right, and recognition of the partiality of what we know about, using language well is important.
Just while we're waiting for the next question, it's so interesting you use the word grace. This gets back to King, the Reverend Dr. Martin, that he could try to tap into what he thought of as a kind of religious consensus, perhaps, in the mid-20th century, which is not so easy to find now. So what would be the secular sources of a kind of civic grace that some citizens in our community might respond to, while others are still willing to tap into the religious sources, whichever particular religion it might be, of seeing a grace between people?
Yeah, so I don't like tolerance, right? Because tolerance kind of says, I tolerate you, right? Tolerance is a far cry from love, right? But maybe respect,
yeah,
right? Respect for you're a human being and you have a right to make your choices, right? Good or bad. And maybe just kind of respecting you as a human being with agency, right? Genuinely respecting you as a human being with agency might be a way.
Yeah. Washington said this in a famous letter to, to a religious minority, either Catholics or Jewish people around 1790, that tolerance is not good enough here in America, right? Individual human beings have equal rights with each other, in this case, to religious liberty, and so the equal respect. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I jumped in and posed a question, so next question.
No, thank you, Professor. One thing that jumped out at me and has continued to jump out at me is, to my mind at least, we used to have an understanding that different institutions in different areas required different levels of sensitivity. Obviously, to my mind at least, I shouldn't say obviously, to my mind it would be very rude to go into a mosque and start decrying Islam and start saying it's an awful, violent religion that's the fault of hundreds of thousands of deaths. But at the same time, there needs to be a place like the New York Times where we can have, or not like the New York Times, I'm thinking the New York Times particularly because of the whole Slack controversy a couple of years ago, there needs to be a public space and a private space. And I was wondering if, where we can talk about policy, but then be respectful to the other person, the Gemeinschaft and the Gesellschaft, in a way. How do we, is there a chance to get that back? Am I just a dreamy-eyed idealist because I want to get that back? Is it fruitful, or should we just try and apply neutral principles across everything instead?
Yeah, so I think people are working to get that back, and I think we do want to get that back. I think this is one of the one of the challenges. I recall like there was a book like Bowling Alone, and so I think we're so like disconnected that really the place where we see people is like social media, right? And that's encourages all kinds of excesses. And so can we have a new public space? I would actually argue that that's the university, that in the university we should try to cultivate those spaces. I know, like for me, I like for the university to be kind of an intermediate space between free American society and like K-12 education, which sometimes you don't have a lot of free speech there, and where we kind of scaffold, right? We kind of create an environment where we try to use, education, encouragement, discouragement, incentives, disincentives to get students to learn how to create that space we create that space in the university and give them the tools to create those spaces outside of the university, like in the workplace, break room, in the teacher's lounge, but I think we need a space first to try and figure out how that works. And I think the university could be that type of space. And I think it's okay for different universities to try to create that space in different ways.
That's connected to you said best practices, right? Local, right? I mean, don't think about some abstract standard maybe, but this community and these real people that you're dealing with. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Coleman, for a genuinely hopeful take on things. It gives me hope. My question is kind of related to that, and I think you sort of started to answer it, but I'm thinking about sort of spaces maybe outside the university that can sort of be forums for maybe this more kind of, whoa, calm down, let's just try to sort of find commonalities approach to this issue. And so the thing that I thought of as you were speaking was something like professional sports. This is something that I think has been a venue for positive interaction between people who are very different. But even that in recent years has become more kind of speech-oriented. And it's tough, right? Because, I don't think we should be telling LeBron James to shut up and dribble. And yet there does seem to be something crucial about things like that. And maybe it's local communities where that can really take place. But what is the place of more sort of banal institutions in our society, and how do we ensure that those sorts of things remain really sort of calming venues apart from the charged atmosphere?
Yeah. In one of my earlier articles, I made an observation that we used to try to persuade lawmakers. And now we try to persuade corporations, right? We're going to boycott you, right? And so I think, there used to be things like town meetings, and like public meetings. And, I don't know that people go to those, right? They go to the games, but, and so what ends up happening is changes that we want to happen in the public meeting, we have to raise them and advocate for them on the sidelines of the games. And so maybe there's something that local communities can do, states can do, government institutions can do to reinvigorate, give people food. I don't know, try to figure out how do we get people there. But I mean, democracy, right? There actually are spaces for the citizens to come together and deliberate, right? This is not a new thing, but they've kind of gone out of style. And so now we end up with public deliberation in all kinds of ways, and we end up making our arguments, right, to corporations, like we're gonna boycott you if you don't do this, right? And so then they have to like do things. But there's a way in which we can talk to people directly. And so I think if there's a way that states and localities can find some way to get people back to the town meetings, back to spaces where they come together as citizens, not as sports fans, not as shoppers, not as students, then I think that is essential for democracy. And I think, we can, maybe once we this new generation coming through with civic education, maybe they will help us to get these town meetings back. But I think that would be the place. School board meetings, I feel like there is institutionalized ways where citizens can come and talk about these issues across difference, but they just haven't been, because we're also so busy maybe, I don't know.
I think we have two final questions.
Okay, so thank you very much. I really appreciated your presentation and the discussion that followed. I'd like to come back to this question. I mean, I totally agree with you about the importance of respect in spaces and spaces for discourse. But at the same time, I feel that we're losing the capability to live with discomfort. And I think that in some of those discussions, we have to be able to be uncomfortable and to get past that, because in the end, we don't make progress when we all just agree with each other. We make progress from the disagreement and finding a way beyond it to some sort of synthesis or some new idea. And I just wonder, how do you see making room for being uncomfortable and yet respectful at the same time?
Yeah, I think it's a hard question. I think the problem is fear, right? I think the reason we don't want to be uncomfortable is not just the uncomfort itself, but I think our discomfort with being uncomfortable is rooted in fear. I think we are now really, really afraid of each other. We're afraid that you're going to vote away, you're going to vote away my freedom of religion, you're going to vote away my bodily autonomy, you're going to vote away. I mean, we're afraid of losing, right? Because so much is at stake. And that makes us kind of uncomfortable with disagreement. It makes us uncomfortable. And so if there's a way in which we can lower the stakes, right? And we can kind of make everything is not like, I have to win this time or I will not have another chance for 25 years, right? And so I think we have to find a way to make people less afraid of each other. And I think that may mean, kind of leaving more things open to change. Maybe it means nailing down and fixing things down like permanently. Maybe we have to leave some wiggle room in the joints. But I don't think people can be comfortable with discomfort until they become less afraid of the people who are making them uncomfortable. Because if you're making me uncomfortable and I'm afraid of you, then that uncomfortable feels threatening because I don't know what's gonna happen to me next. But if you're a safe person, right, and I'm uncomfortable, then it's just uncomfortable. I'm not like afraid for my life or whatever. So I think we have to try and find a way to be less afraid of each other.
Thank you, Professor Coleman. My question is, do you believe that there's a correlation with cancel culture and people creating their own media echo chambers?
Yes. I would say, I am totally on board with not wanting people to endure, abuse, verbal abuse, right? And I think in order to have a marketplace, right, it needs to be a place in which everyone can speak without being, disparaged in a way. Unfortunately, when social regulation of speech is distorted and dysfunctional, it doesn't actually kind of improve the marketplace and make it more respectful. It just means some groups leave kind of a broader public marketplace for like a smaller echo chamber, right? And so I think we really have to think about, like, if the idea, right, is marketplace of ideas and we want people to all be welcome in the marketplace, we can't use approach to make the marketplace welcoming and inclusive that actually sends everybody out to their own little silos. So yes, I think that there is one of the things I told my family when I talked to them and forced them to listen to my research is we have to rethink about creating inclusion through methods that may produce kind of some exclusion for some people, right? I mean, and I totally understand, right? It's like people feel like there's a historical component. We are so tired of listening to the racists. Like, we want them to be quiet now, right? And I can understand that impulse. But I think, many times the marginalized groups have actually had experience with exclusion, right? And so we kind of know, right, how it works and like the harms of it. And I think we have to take that knowledge with us when we try to make the marketplace more inclusive. And I think, and have to find, maybe these are the tools that are around and the tools that are here, and these are the only tools that we have, but I think we have to create new tools, right? And I think that I really believe we actually have the creativity and the imagination to create new tools.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, you spoke of institutions where people come together and with food, so I hope you will stay for the reception that we have and some light refreshments. I do have a few closing remarks before we get there. I do have to say it was so nice to see just in the people who came to the microphone to pose questions, the mix of people we had. We had some ASU students, we had some community members, we had some ASU faculty who asked lousy questions. But the mix of people coming together. So some closing remarks. I hope all the students here, and again, anyone interested in this higher kind of civic education will gather some information on the way out about the school, our curriculum, our degrees, our new PPE certificate that I mentioned. We hope, and also look at our website, we hope to see you all about a month from now. February 24th and 25th is our annual conference. We do this every spring. It's on the theme of this season of the Civic Discourse Project on ideological conformity on campus and in American society. The main keynote address is by the president of Johns Hopkins University, Ronald Daniels, who'll be talking, a lawyer. We're way too nice to lawyers. A lawyer who will be talking about a book he wrote in 2021 about civic education at American universities, what universities owe democracy. And we also have a range of speakers and a day and a half of panels from left and center and right talking about these issues of free discourse and ideological conformity. Thanks, as we do for every one of these events, thanks to our terrific team in the school, our events and communication staff members, particularly Marlene and Janelle and Molly and Allison, Matt Sanasuso, our assistant director, our student workers. I mentioned Jim Weinstein from the O'Connor College of Law, served on the committee for putting together the speaker series this year. Another professor who's not with us tonight, Peter DeMarnoff, and from the philosophy faculty here at ASU, is also on that committee, thanks to him. Thank you to the O'Connor College of Law for co-sponsoring this Civic Discourse Project for all these years, to Arizona PBS for being our stalwart partners in this for a 6th year. If you enjoyed this kind of civic discourse, again, we hope you'll look at our archive, our video archive, but we also have a podcast that we call Keeping It Civil. A professor from the School of Politics and Global Studies here at ASU, Henry Thompson, is the host now for that podcast, sort of extended interviews with the speakers who come for the Civic Discourse Project. So again, we hope to see you a month from now at our next Civic Discourse Project event, and we hope you'll stay for the reception. And with that, please join me one last round of thanks to our speaker, Franciska Coleman. That was splendid.
Oh,
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having
Thank you
me.
so much. Masterclass.